All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. It's nice to see all of you. It's nice to be together. It's a beautiful day out there. I'm Ann McGinnis. I'm one of the partners here in the Rochester office at Schoeneck King, and I'll be starting us off today. And I'm joined here by my colleagues, Jeff Weiss, who is a partner in our Buffalo office, and Katie Stifler, who is a new associate to us, who has joined our special education team, and we're very happy to have her. And Andrew Mark, another one of our colleagues from Buffalo, will be coming in a little bit later. All right, we also have a bunch of people on our webinar portion. And so any questions that we have to go through the microphone so that they can hear it. So I know that I really personally dislike a microphone, but we have to use it so that they can fully access what we're talking about today. And if you raise your hand, one of us will come to you with a microphone, much like a talk show. So that'll be your moment. And also, all of our webinars are always on the website, the Schoeneck King website. If you go to the school law section, you can access any of the seminars or webinars that we've done in the past, and this one will be on there as well if you want to take a listen again because it was so exciting today. So to start us off today, we're talking about 4 topics. I'm going to start off talking about food allergies with all of you. And then Jeff is going to come up and talk about transportation. Is that right, Jeff? Transportation accommodations, hot topic. And then I'm going to come back and talk about assistive technology. And then Andrew is going to finish it off for us with transition for our older students who are transitioning out. And we come up with these topics based on frequently asked questions from all of you. And these are definitely some topics that are challenging. And so hopefully we can work through that together. And as always, if you have questions, comments, reactions, just let us know. We like this to be interactive. All right, I'm going to start off with food allergies. And actually, Katie developed these slides for us, and she did a nice job. And the reason that we're talking about this is because State Ed released some guidance on food allergies a few months ago that nobody seems to know about. And if you do know about it, good for you. And if you don't know about it, now you do. And part of that guidance includes some policy requirements that school districts have to implement by the end of this month, so by tomorrow. But don't panic if you haven't done it yet. Don't panic. I mean, a lot of us are still working on our restraint seclusion policies that were supposed to be updated last year, right? So sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but this gives you a heads up that it is something that we should be working on. And we're going to work through what that is. It's also a topic that is close to my heart because baby Joe has a peanut allergy. So I'm already thinking about his Section 504 plan. It's going to be really good. So watch out, whatever district we're in for that. Okay, some of the most common food allergies among students, which we know, peanuts, tree nuts, milk, eggs, shellfish, sesame, wheat, soy, and fish. Now, some allergies can be minor reactions, but some can be life-threatening. Anaphylactic reactions are life-threatening. They require immediate intervention. And so we need to know what student needs are, and we need staff who are trained to identify that so that they can intervene or get help if they need to. That's very important. And we're also seeing an increase in food allergies. I don't really know why that is. There's probably some complicated reasons, but kids are coming to school with more significant food allergies than ever. And a lot of the questions we get are around parents asking for certain accommodations for food allergies. So I once had a question where a parent wanted hand washing stations installed in every hallway and a requirement that anytime the students left their classrooms, they would have to wash their hands because their child had a peanut allergy. And that would obviously be a significant undertaking to do that. And so how do we navigate that? Obviously, we have a parent who's very scared that her child has a life-threatening allergy. So how do we balance that with putting some reasonable accommodations in place? And really, when there's a question around that, it falls under Section 504, typically. So Section 504 is a federal law that provides protections to students with disabilities against discrimination, but it also requires us to provide accommodations to students with disabilities if they have certain certain medical needs or other type of disability related needs. And a lot of districts handle food allergies through student health plans. We call them individualized health plans, IHPs. But if you'll remember from when we've done our Section 504 training in the past through our seminars, that if there's a mitigating measure, we can't take that into consideration when considering a student's eligibility for Section 504. So what does that mean? A mitigating measure is anything that we provide, anything that's provided to a student that might mitigate the symptoms or the behaviors associated with that disability. A concrete example would be a student with ADHD who is provided a stimulant medication. If they're on that stimulant medication and if they're not showing symptoms of ADHD because of that, that medication is a mitigating measure. And under Section 504, we have to consider if the student would require Section 504 accommodations and protections as if that mitigating measure was not present. So we essentially have to say if this student was not on this stimulant medication, would they need accommodations under Section 504, which is hard to do because we're not going to ask parents to send their kids to school for a week without being on their medication, so we can figure that out. But we can assume, and the Federal Department of Education says that we should assume for ADHD that they likely do need accommodations without that mitigating measure. And I'm bringing this back to food allergies. So another mitigating measure are health plans. So if a student's disability-related needs are addressed through a health plan, which you should have those individual health plans, those IHPs, they're important. But if that addresses the needs, that's a mitigating measure, which means if they would require Section 504 accommodations without that mitigating measure, the health plan, which yes, they would, because the health plan is all about accommodations, then they're entitled to that Section 504 plan. So to be very concrete about this, arguably any student with an IHP is legally entitled to a Section 504 plan. Now, I know that some of you might already be doing that, and that's great. I'm not saying this to cause mass panic and have you go back and change all of your practices. Ultimately, what matters is that we're accommodating a student, but something to think about. And certainly the more significant the need, the more likely you should have a 504 plan. And if you have a parent like future me who's going to insist on a 504 plan, even if there's an IHP, you should say yes to that because they're legally entitled to that. Any questions about that? All right, so let's talk about specifically for food allergies, Section 504. So we know that a student is entitled to Section 504 accommodations in a Section 504 plan if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So when we're looking at food allergies, we know that they have a physical impairment because they have a food allergy. So then we have to consider if it substantially limits a major life activity. And it's not an automatic yes. There's certain allergies, if they're not major, if they just cause a rash or something like that, maybe that would not be a substantial limitation. But some examples of substantial limitation could be, I'm caught up. Some examples of major life activities that can be substantially limited are the operation of the respiratory or gastrointestinal systems, which are major bodily functions, which fall under Section 504 protections, and which can affect an individual's breathing or concentrating, which are also major bodily functions. And so therefore they're major life activities. Back in 2008, the ADA was updated. So before 2008, when we were considering a student's eligibility for a 504 plan, we really looked at learning. Did the disability or did the physical or mental impairment impact their learning in some way? But when they were amended in 2008, they broadened that definition. So there's things on there like thinking, concentrating, breathing. There's a lot more things under that definition of a major bodily function or substantially limiting major life activity under the updated 2008 amendments. So you can see food allergies, significant food allergies can fall under that. And if a student meets all of those criteria, they're entitled to a Section 504 plan. We cannot require documentation or medical information from parents in making this decision. We actually can't ever require that parents give us medical documentation or diagnoses or anything when we're considering Section 504 eligibility for any reason. We can ask, and if they have it, we can consider it, but we can't require it. So we can't say to a parent, well, your child might have ADHD, but you haven't given us a diagnosis, so we don't know if they have it, so we can't give you a 504 plan. It's on us as a school district to identify if they need that. And we do that through an evaluation. And under Section 504, an evaluation can be very specific to whatever the reason for the referral is. It could be consulting with your medical director. It could be doing some limited testing in some way. It really depends. It doesn't have to be the full evaluation like what you do for CSE, but we do have to gather information to help us make that decision if they have that physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. We can't require the parents to give us that. And the reason for that is because we have to provide a free appropriate public education to students. That applies to 504 and special education. And requiring parents to give us a diagnosis or medical documentation is not free for them. But we also have that child find obligation under Section 504 and the IDEA, where we have to identify, locate, and evaluate any student with qualifying disabilities. So those are all those are our legal obligations. So we can't turn parents away or find a student ineligible because the parents have failed to give us information. That gets tricky with medical stuff. Luckily for medical stuff, usually that information is freely shared. It's unusual that we wouldn't be able to get it from parents, but it does come up sometimes. Oh, and I should say, I referenced state guidance. There's also federal guidance. We have the links for both of those at the end of these materials, just so you know. So you'll be able to access those. And this information comes from that. So how should a school address a student's food allergy? If it results in the student having a disability under Section 504, the student may require accommodations to meaningfully access or benefit from the school's educational opportunities. And some accommodations could include, now these are just examples, it's an individual student determination. And you can see how it's actually useful to do this through the Section 504 team. Because if a parent says, I want a hand washing station, it's really the Section 504 team that has that legal authority to consider it and either deny it or decide some other accommodation that's going to be provided instead. You really don't want that to be a conversation just between the parent and the district outside of a formal committee, such as the 504 team or the CSE. So some examples of accommodations that you might see are designating allergy-free eating areas and providing clearly labeled allergen-free food options in cafeterias and at school events. So we are required, if we're serving food to all students, we are required to provide food that students with food allergies or any other kind of food needs, if they need a gluten-free diet, we're required to provide them options under that. Also, as far as these peanut-free tables, maybe consider instead having a peanut table. I think that kids with allergies already feel different in a lot of ways, and it's hard for them to have to sit in a way that's isolated from their other peers. And a lot of food allergies are not airborne. So actually peanuts are not an airborne allergy. That's something that people don't realize. So if you have a student who knows not to eat the food of the other kids have brought, they can sit at the same table as that student. But that's an individual decision that needs to be made if that student is able to do that. Prohibiting certain foods in classrooms or school buildings and providing notice to students and families about food allergy related rules. I had a request once that a school was egg free. And that there were no eggs in the school because somebody having eggs next to a student could cause that student to have an allergy. I'm not a medical doctor. I do know a lot about food allergies. That's probably unlikely, but when you have questions like that, get your medical director involved to get a medical opinion about, is this a thing? Is it really a problem if somebody walks by with a tray with scrambled eggs? With a student where we would have to have nobody have any eggs in here. You can help that. You can use that information to help you decide on an individual student basis if this is a reasonable accommodation request or not. Our obligation is always to consider anything a parent asks for, but we don't necessarily need to grant it. But if we're going to deny it, we should have evidence, some kind of information to help back up that denial. Other examples of accommodations is allowing the student to make up work without penalty and excusing late arrivals and absences due to a medical appointment or when food allergies hinder a student's ability to complete their work. When you're having a severe allergic reaction, you feel very unwell, and frequently the treatment that they give you, maybe an EpiPen, that makes you feel unwell too, or Benadryl makes you feel unwell. So it might be difficult for students to show up at school that day or the next day and be ready and alert, available to learn. So do we need to consider accommodations around that? Ensuring eating and learning environments are free of food allergens, including during field trips and extracurricular activities. For example, by wiping down tables, chairs, and other surfaces before use by the student with an allergy. Again, an individual decision to make. I would say the most frequent calls that I get about these food allergy issues are when we have class trips. The kids are away from home, it's an overnight trip, they eat something they've never had before, they didn't realize that it had something in it, they have an allergic reaction, and that's scary. What do? We need to make sure that we have planned ahead so that the chaperones on that trip know what to do, that we have a plan with the student for how we're going to identify the food that that student's going to eat to make sure it's safe for that student. We need to take into consideration the student's developmental level. If a student is a cognitively average student who's 18, they're probably going to need less support than our younger kids, our kids with more significant disabilities. And then even if a student with a food allergy has a disability but does not need accommodations, they're still protected from discrimination under Section 504. And that's true for any student. We have lots of students with disabilities who don't need a Section 504 plan or an IEP, but under Section 504 law, they're still protected against discrimination, which means if they believe they have been discriminated against, they could bring an action against the district under Section 504. Any questions? Yes. Here, I'll just go.
I have a student with a 504 plan who has a sun allergy, and currently for recess, there's a pop-up tent set up for her and it's not working. Her allergy is progressive and her mom is asked about building a permanent shelter. Listening to you, it sounds like it might be something for the 504 committee to hear and see if that request is reasonable. Would that be the appropriate process?
Wow, I've never had that question. I've never heard of a sun allergy, but I have had students with albinism who cannot be in the direct sun. So I think that it's probably a similar type of thing. So yes, absolutely. The Section 504 team should consider the request and should consider, are there other ways that we can accommodate the student? Can we allow for there to be an indoor option for all students to use and to choose to use? Do we have to make sure that there's always peers around so this student isn't isolated? Those are some examples of other things that we can consider. Oh, yeah.
I just thought of something, the pop-up tent. There are tents that filter the UV radiation, and then there's tents that don't. So you may want to look at one that does that. Some of the camping ones will filter.
Right, that's collaboration. So right, you need to consider the parent's request, you need to consider the need, and then identify what the reasonable accommodations are. Now, obviously saying she has to stay inside while everybody else is outside could be considered discriminatory. So we have to be really careful about how we go about that to make it be an inclusive situation for her. But you're not automatically on the hook for building a shelter, but you could be. It depends, which is a real lawyer answer. Other questions or thoughts? That's a good one. Do you have any thoughts about that, Jeff? Here, just take this.
Thanks. No, I think you nailed it. I think you have to go through the process. You have to consider it. You never want to say no before you go through the process. Even though you're thinking, I'm probably going to say no, you have to say, let's talk about it. It might, the solution of build a structure, that might work. That probably will work. But as Ann said, there could be several good solutions, several appropriate solutions. And if there's another one that's effective, enables a FAPE, you could do that one too. And it's the structure might be better, but what's FAPE is appropriate. It's not best. So tough conversations to have, but if there's you don't want to say cheaper, can't say that, but if you're thinking this works, I'll go that direction. And I think it was very interesting, the collaboration. This is why you have a 504 meeting with a group of experts. So somebody could say, hey, I'm an expert. I've got this idea. Here's the solution.
That's another one that's a good idea to get your medical director involved, either as a member of the 504 team or consult ahead of time. All right, moving on. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a student with a food allergy could be entitled to an IEP under the IDEA if the allergy adversely affects the student's educational performance and the student needs special education or related services because of that. It's not that likely that a food allergy alone would require a need for special education services. It's possible, but it's not as likely. But you might have a student who has another qualifying disability in special education in addition to food allergies. And that happens all the time. And in that situation, you need to make sure the IEP also addresses the accommodations needed for the food allergy. You wouldn't have a need to have a separate 504 plan and IEP. And the reason for that is because students with IEPs automatically get all of those Section 504 protections through that IEP. It's part of that. There's a few different plans that are identified in the state guidance, and they do differentiate what they are. I think that it's a lot of different plans that we could have for a student. So in my opinion, we're going to go through all of them and what their different purposes are. It's fine to have all of these different plans, but it's also, in my mind, fine to have it all in one plan as long as you actually have the plan. And it could be through the 504 plan that has all this information, or you could have on the 504 plan that the student will have an IHP as an accommodation. And then that IHP is developed offline with the nurse the way it typically would be with the parents. That would be fine too. Again, you need the plan. That's what's important. So individual student plans, according to SCD, would include whether the student is permitted to carry and self-administer their own medication. We're going to talk about that more. The plan for school personnel to be able to readily communicate with the school nurse or medical director if the nurse is not available, and consideration of the distance between the school health office or trained personnel to the student to ensure rapid administration of an EpiPen if the student needs that. The same procedure applies to things like glucagon, which is a rescue medication for diabetes. Same considerations. And SED has a medication management guidance document that if you Google NYSED medication management, you'll find it. I think it was updated in 2022. It's actually a really helpful guidance document. I recommend it if you have students with medical needs. It breaks down the different considerations for who can administer what types of medications given what they are. And it also breaks down some considerations based on the student's medical needs. So there's a section on allergies, there's a section on seizures, there's a section on diabetes. So it's a great reference document to pull out if you're not sure, because there are different rules depending on the medication. So things like EpiPens or glucagon, we can train unlicensed personnel to administer those. But things like most seizure rescue medications require a licensed medical person to administer them. We can't train to unlicensed people. So a lot of it depends on the student's needs and the type of medication. Back to these student plans, plan to address prevention strategies and management of anaphylaxis in all areas of the school the student is in, including the cafeteria and on the bus. I find that districts frequently forget about the bus. We are required to provide accommodations for the bus. If a student has a life-threatening food allergy, we need to make sure there's a plan for the bus. Kids bring granola bars on the bus, they sneak food in. It would be very easy to have an accidental ingestion. And we need to know what the plan is if that happens. Can we count on the bus driver to know if that's happening and to be able to administer the EpiPen? I don't know. That's something we need to decide on an individual student basis. Or does it require more adult support on the bus? That's something to decide. Plans to meet the students' needs on field trips and during school events. So under Section 504 law, we're required to provide accommodations students with disabilities need to be able to access any of the programs that the school provides. So that includes things like field trips. That includes things like sports or extracurricular activities or clubs or class trips where they're going overnight, or if the district is running a daycare. It includes all of those situations. We're required under Section 504 law, because as a public school district, you are receiving federal funds. You're required to provide those reasonable accommodations to any activity that you're providing to a student. And this requires a lot of advanced planning. And you can see how this could come up if a student has a need for a nurse, a one-to-one nurse, if a student has a need for a one-to-one aide. We need to make sure way ahead of time that we know what that is for the student and that we have it there. I frequently get questions. We have the class dance tonight. We have a student with a seizure disorder who has a nurse on their 504 plan. Do we need to give a nurse? Well, probably. The ultimate decision of if we need to give a nurse should be made by the 504 team or the CSE. That's why there should be advanced planning, because it's not automatic. Students might have a one-to-one aide on their IEP and not need an aide for sports, or they might need it. It's up to the CSE or the 504 team to determine that. And if they need it, we're supposed to provide it. Ongoing communication during the school year with parents and guardians. We're going back to this, and methods for staff to readily identify students with life-threatening allergies. Any questions about anything I just said? I just said a
Well,
lot.
We have a question
Ooh,
from the virtual audience. My district is trying to implement a share fridge in the cafeteria where students can share produce, juice, and milk from their reimbursable meals. This is not food from home. My lead nurse is concerned that a student with an allergy may take something they shouldn't. Any ideas on how to handle this?
Right. Okay, so I guess this is like leftover food that they're not using, so they don't throw it away and it's available for kids.
That sounds right.
Okay, it's a good idea. Yeah, same rules, right? Kids are in the cafeteria choosing food. We need to make sure that there's a plan for how that's monitored. It would be the same thing for any time we're giving kids any kind of food. We have a class party. We have a fridge that kids, yeah, if we have a fridge that kids can help themselves, it needs to be an individual plan for kids that need it.
So from a practical standpoint, they need like a fridge monitor, right? Someone,
Can you guys hear him?
can you hear me?
Okay.
So from a practical standpoint, I guess we need like an adult to keep an eye on the fridge and say,
Yeah, if
Johnny-
there's,
Johnny can't take the milk carton.
right,
or-
if there's kids who need that as an accommodation, yes. Yeah, I don't know if it's like a great idea for kids just to go and help themselves without any adult oversight.
Right, well, it's tough because, well, let's flip this. Let's go the extra mile. I mean, so like some high schools, they'll have a student-run snack shop, right? So, and they might sell Snickers bars. What if the student's allergic to peanuts? It's a really, you'd think an older student would be able to self-monitor. But yeah, I guess this can create a lot of practical, like because you can't tell the students, Johnny's, some of these could be, I think the school would need a lot more information and figure out a practical way to monitor this without, protecting confidentiality. But I got a feeling this was a question in an elementary school setting. Because high school kids don't eat school lunch, right? No, I'm just kidding. But that was my take on it. But I think from a practical standpoint, when food is distributed, in a setting like this, there has to be some oversight by the staff.
I agree. And these are all things that the 504 team should be thinking about. So make sure when you come to the table, you're brainstorming other situations where food might be involved and what kind of accommodations the child might need. All right, another type of plan is an emergency care plan. It's developed by the school nurse for students with chronic health conditions. That's designed to be used by unlicensed school personnel and outlines the care a student might need in an emergency in the absence of a school nurse. So this is a good idea, and pediatricians give these plans to parents when their kids have certain medical conditions. And it basically says things like, if you have a food allergy, it might say something like, if the student only has hives or a skin reaction, give them Benadryl or Zyrtec. And if the student has any of these other symptoms, such as vomiting or swelling or difficulty breathing, administer the EpiPen and call 911. Those can be examples of what it says. And so these need to be done in conjunction with the student's physician. The ECP has to stress action school personnel should take in an emergency, make it step by step and very clear, write it in lay language, so that you don't need to be a medical professional to understand what the steps are, and include emergency contact information for the parents and guardians or the student's healthcare provider. And then an individualized healthcare plan, an IHP, is a nursing care plan developed by an RN based on diagnosis, interventions, and expected student outcomes. They're usually written in nurse language and outlines the plan of care in response to a student's medical diagnosis, including protocols and addressing medication or treatment needs. And it's sometimes written for students with IEPs if they have skilled nursing services listed as a related service. And we talked about Section 504, but that would provide accommodations that are needed in school for students with specific health needs or disabilities to fully participate in the school day and school events. So everything we're talking about, things like an emergency care plan, that's arguably an accommodation. All right, I'm going to pass this off to Katie to handle this next part about student medication administration.
Right. Good morning, everyone. I'm lucky enough to be part of a team that has generously allowed me to do a couple slides. So I'm not Anne, but bear with me. All right. So for this next few slides, we're going to talk about medication administration considerations and just give you an overview of the 3 different categories that we use for these students. The 3 categories are our nurse-dependent students, supervised students, and independent students. So for this first category, nurse-dependent students, these are going to be our students who cannot self-administer their own medication. They also can't be considered supervised students according to criteria for supervised students, which we'll cover on the next slide. So these students have to have their medication administered to them by an appropriately licensed health professional. The next category of supervised students is students who have been determined to need supervision, and this determination has been made either by the school nurse or the student's healthcare provider. These students may be assisted by a trained, unlicensed personnel. So trained unlicensed just means that this is somebody who has received training, but they're not otherwise a licensed health professional. They can help a supervised student to self-administer that student's medication. But 2 important factors, any assistance is going to be only at the direction of that student. And additionally, any assistance from the unlicensed personnel is going to be limited to tasks that that supervised student really needs assistance with. And our last category is independent students. These are students who are able to self-administer their own medications. They don't need assistance from anybody. Generally, medications for these students are going to be stored in the health office for the student to go and get and then self-administer. There is an exception for students who are able to carry and use their own emergency medication. So this might be a rescue albuterol inhaler that a student is able to have on them and self-administer when they need it, which Anne is going to talk about later in the presentation. So an independent student with a self-carry order can take their medication anywhere in the school, on school property, and at school functions. And this is going to include field trips as well. Such students, talking about the emergency medication, must not be required to go to the health office to get that medication because we're concerned about any delay that may result in a negative health outcome. So if a student is experiencing symptoms or needs that medication immediately, we don't want them to have to go maybe across the school to get that medication from the health office. All right, and back to Anne.
Thank you. All right, so when we're talking about these emergency rescue medications, there's a few different types, many different types that students might need. So an example could be like an inhaler. So if a student has asthma and needs a rescue inhaler, and if they are an independent student, they have to be permitted to carry that inhaler with them so that they can take it when they need it. For things like food allergies, for an EpiPen, same thing, they need to have that on them. But just a lot of times when you're having an allergic reaction that requires an EpiPen, there's symptoms that make it difficult for you to be able to take care of yourself in that moment. And so even though they're self-carrying, they will likely need some intervention to help them administer that EpiPen to them. If a student is able to self-carry, there has to be a provider order that attests that the provider has determined the student is able to self-administer their own medication effectively. So that would be from their medical doctor, and they also need written parent or guardian consent. And again, we should consider if the student will need assistance to administer that rescue medication. And if so, we should have appropriate school personnel available for that. We're going to talk about that a little more. Any student who requires rescue medications for allergies should have a written emergency care plan developed by the nurse or medical director, be instructed of how to obtain help from school personnel, and have additional doses of the medication kept in the health office in the event the student does not have access to their medication. It's also permissible for schools to have a non-patient specific order for EpiPen to keep a supply of EpiPen in the nurse's office, and the nurse can make that medical determination if somebody is presenting symptoms of anaphylaxis, even if they have no previous history of that, and administer the EpiPen to them in that situation. It's not required to have those EpiPens stocked, but it is permissible. Staff training, specifically for EpiPens, it is permissible to train unlicensed personnel to administer them. When I say unlicensed, I mean people who are not don't have a medical license, like a nurse or a medical doctor. And when we give training, we need to know which allergens cause life-threatening reactions, steps to take to prevent exposure to allergens, how to recognize symptoms of an allergic reaction, and how to respond to an emergency. When I was a school psychologist, people only needed to be trained on this if they volunteered. I think it was written in the CBA that we couldn't require teachers to be trained on this. And so we had to be careful about where we would place students in classes. So if you have a situation like that where it's voluntary for staff to be trained, be sure that you're thinking about placing students who need this in classes with staff who have been trained. That's important. And here are the conditions under the law that we can train staff to administer EpiPens. It has to be an emergency situation. It has to be when an appropriately licensed health professional is not available. And it has to be to students with a healthcare provider order and written parent or guardian consent. And if we choose to train unlicensed school personnel to administer emergency EpiPens, there is a required training from the New York State Department of Health that they need to take. So we need to be thoughtful if the student is involved in sports or going on a field trip that we have staff trained. If they may need an EpiPen, we have staff trained to be able to administer that. It is permissible that parents can choose to go and take on this role. We can't require it, but if we have a class trip and if a student has any kind of medical need and if a parent says, I'll go and address the medical needs, great. We should say, yes, please, because that makes our life a lot easier when they do that. I've had schools say things like, oh, well, parent chaperones are chosen on a lottery and they weren't chosen. Well, that's a time to make an exception because they're really playing a role more than just a typical chaperone, especially for students with significant needs that might require nursing. It's really hard to find nurses to do stuff like this, to go on class trips. It's also permissible under the law for a parent to designate another adult to administer their child's medication. And I think that the law is written in a way that says like a friend or something like that. It's written in a way where when schools have called and have said, can the parent designate the teacher to do this? I think no, I think that's probably not in the spirit of the law because it's supposed to be a personal connection. If we read the law on its face, and this is for medication that isn't, unlicensed personnel. This is, for example, if a student needs a seizure medication that only a licensed personnel can provide. If the parent says that they'll go and they'll administer it, we're off the hook. If the parent designates another adult to go on the trip and administer it, we're off the hook, but we cannot require it. So if the parent says, I'm not doing that, then we need to make sure that a nurse goes if the student might need medication that can only be administered by a nurse, which again, not EpiPens, but other types of medication. Policy requirements, according to the Department of Health and SED, like I said, we're supposed to have policies developed or updated by this month, but if you haven't done it yet, just put that on your to-do list. So the written policies need to guide personnel consistent with state and federal laws, has to include how frequently we're going to be reviewing the policy, a plan for that, identification of school personnel roles and responsibilities, identification and provision of professional development and education for both licensed and unlicensed personnel, written strategies to reduction of exposure to allergens in school, training school personnel on preventing and responding to anaphylaxis, sending a notification at least once per calendar year to parents and guardians of all students to make them aware of the policy and procedures, development of individualized emergency care plans for students at risk for anaphylaxis and other serious medical conditions, development of communication plans with students and parents about safe and unsafe foods and strategies to avoid exposure to unsafe foods, development of a policy regarding possession and use of EpiPens, and written district policy for calling for emergency transport in 911, including which school personnel will accompany the student until a parent guardian is present. So if a student needs an EpiPen, you have to call an ambulance and they have to go to the hospital immediately. The role of school administrators, we should include them in the district's emergency response plan, where we outline the emergency procedure for managing life-threatening allergic reactions, in addition to other things in that plan. Have a plan in place to manage students with allergies and treat symptoms of anaphylaxis in collaboration with the district's medical director, communicate school policies for managing allergies to all school staff, including substitutes. That's important. You need to have a plan in place, not just for allergies, for any kind of disability-related need that a substitute might need to address. How are we going to make sure they're up to speed on that when they show up to sub for that day? Hard to do. So you need to make sure your building has a plan. The building that I was in had folders for every teacher with information in it. If they had 504 plans, BIPs, IEPs, emergency plans, that kind of thing. And when subs would come in, they would review that and there would be directions for who they could talk to if they needed more information on a situation. That's just one example. Administrators should ensure training of teachers and other school personnel who interact with students who have a life-threatening allergy. Nurses are usually all over this. Nurses are usually really good about staying on top of this, but there's no harm in a building administrator touching base with a nurse to make sure it's happening. Ensure or provide communication devices to be available for emergencies and all school activities, including transportation, like a walkie-talkie or a cell phone or something, so you can call for help. Ensure staff understand the school's responsibilities under relevant law. All of those are things that our administrators can do to support this. And here's the links for the information. You can see that the SED guidance is on there. There was also some federal guidance from this year that's on there as well. Any questions, comments? Yes.
So I'm just wondering, when it comes to paying for parents to go on field trips, just in terms of appropriate use of public funds and all of those pieces, is that appropriate to allocate from district funds, or do we go to boosters? Like, how do we compensate that?
So there isn't anything that I'm aware of in the law that says we have to pay the parents, but I think we should think about doing that. It's pay for their trip. I think we should consider that, because in situations where a student might need a nurse or a one-to-one aide and there's a class trip and a parent volunteers to do that, maybe we should pay the parents' way, because again, it's making our life easier and we'd have to pay for the nurse anyway, not only to go on the trip, but then the salary for the nurse. So it's still a savings for us to do that. So I think it's a good idea. It's not an automatically required thing. And I think it would be fine to use district funds for that purpose, because again, we would be on the hook for paying for that and more if the parent wasn't going, because we would have to find personnel to do that. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely not a gift of public funds because you're providing an accommodation. And, you know, we always say like a savvy, you know, the variables are pay for my trip, pay for my meals, pay for my luggage. I mean, if a crafty parent recognizes that, I shouldn't say crafty, but if the parent recognizes that they have leverage, they might be able to negotiate terms that we otherwise wouldn't give. If we can't find a nurse and we really want them to go, they might say, you know, I mean, I've never seen it, but we always joke around theoretically, but if you don't want to pay and the parent refuses to go, then we have a big problem. So somehow we try to work it out.
I did once have a parent who was a nurse say that we should pay for their salary to go. And there's actually law that no, we don't have to do that. I had to look that up. Yeah.
Right, because then they'd be our employee, right?
Right.
It's kind of tricky, and then it's union issues and so on. And then they'll say, well, oh boy, that's a whole other can of worms where you see that with, they want that, you know, retain my private nurse,
Yeah.
contract with them, and they say, well, we pay nurses $20 an hour and they usually get 40. So, you know, we can't do that. So I digress. Oh, question.
I'm coming.
Yeah.
So we have students that have to go on, or they go on trips, overnight trips for field trips. They require one-to-one aides. So the cost for those aides has to be borne by the school district, because we've gotten pushback saying that the kids have to bear, the other families have to bear the cost of hiring more buses to field them. So we want to verify that that's the CSE, since they require it, the school district has to bear the cost for that, correct?
Correct. We cannot put increased costs on parents to provide accommodations that students need. That is one of the few things that I can say, this is a clear cut. We can't do it. Again, free appropriate public education. We cannot put that cost on parents. And if I get it, funds are tight, I get it. What you could do is have that passed off to everybody and just increase how much everybody's paying. I wouldn't advertise that that's why. You certainly shouldn't say, well, Johnny needs a nurse, so you guys have to pay $100 more. We should not say that. But that's one way to address the cost issue if it really is a burden for the district. But we cannot require that parents pay more for any accommodations that their child needs, for anything that we do. So if we have a daycare after school, we can't require that they pay more for that because their child needs accommodations. If we have a trip, we can't require that their child pays more for that. Lots and lots of decisions on this, guys. This is very clear. That's a good question, because I get that question a lot.
When it comes to a child having an EpiPen, and we've determined that they need it within the district, but they're not a self-carry, but it is to a point where they need to have it with them throughout the day. Is there anything we need from the doctor to say that it is the teachers carrying the medication and not stored in the nurse's office?
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that teachers will carry EpiPens in that situation. But I think we have to be careful. I've seen teachers have like whole baggies of medication that they take on field trips, and it's all kinds of stuff. And I think that's probably going too far. But if it's an emergency medication, then you probably do need it to be close by to the student. That should all be part of the planning that's done for that specific student. Do you know if?
Yeah, well, I think Ann's right, 100%. I think I use the term, what's your window of opportunity? Like, you have to have in your plan, it needs to say, upon the onset of an incident of of a medical emergency, how much time do you have to administer the medication? And that's going to answer your question. If you have 15 minutes, sure, you can leave it in the nurse's office. If you have 2 minutes, it's got to be nearby. And that will determine. And again, hopefully it's right, but hopefully it's not in a huge garbage bag with like 25 other EpiPens and you're scrambling. Like, you need to be able to get it and use it quickly. And so, but that's by the way, that's the crucial piece for bus transportation as well. How much time do you have? And what's the outcome if you don't get the medication in that window of opportunity? And your answers will be pretty clear when you look at it that way about staffing.
All right, good questions. Okay, I'm going to pass this off to Jeff to talk about transportation.
Good morning. I like a program. I like, you need Clark Kent, like the see-through, and you can see the like that. So, all right. Good morning, everybody. We're here to talk about a great topic: transportation accommodations for students with disabilities. The duty to accommodate extends to any school-sponsored event. And the transportation is certainly school-sponsored. So there's no question that it's like a moving classroom, and we're obligated to continue to accommodate. This is a tough one. Think about it. It's moving. Like, it's dangerous. There's a lot of variables on a school bus. It's not highly staffed. You could be far away from home. There's a lot of external factors. So this is a challenge. So we really got to make sure we get this right. But it's funny, like, I realized as I was putting these papers together that I am woefully unqualified to do this presentation because I never took a school bus going to school. I grew up in New York City, and you don't have yellow school buses in New York City. You take a city bus. They give you a bus pass or a subway or so on. Or you get to walk. So I tell my kids, like, you have it so good. You got this nice yellow bus, picks you up in front of your house. Driver says hello. Like, imagine, it's funny because I used to hate Halloween because I used to have to walk like 3 blocks. And sometimes I'd be carrying like I played a trombone. Imagine in New York City, walking with a trombone, getting egged, like it was the moving buses and so on. So I don't know. I didn't experience the bus life. But there was something interesting. And I remembered, now I get it. I was a bus counselor. So I went to day camp. From 14 to 21, I was a counselor. So I started out as a junior counselor, then you become a counselor and so on. So I was so good at being a counselor that when I was 16, I became a bus counselor. So picture Jeff Weiss, 16 years old, in charge of a school bus with about 45 kids under the age of 13. And it's me and the driver. So and let me tell you, I took that job seriously. I sit down, no trouble on my, so I really believe in transportation accommodations. So I take it back. I am fully qualified. I love it. Okay, no. So everyone, tell your kids to sit down on that bus and let's go. So, okay, I digress. So a little levity. Let's get right to it. So we're going to start with, let me get this. Okay, we're going to start with a concept here, which is all gen ed kids are entitled to transportation, students without disabilities. They're entitled to transportation pursuant to education law and pursuant to district policy. You probably have a policy, I'm sure you do, And it probably has some specific rules. It probably says, maybe it says all kids get bused to school regardless of where you live. It also might say, if you're in elementary school, you get a ride. It might say, if you live more than a mile away, you're entitled to a ride. There are all these entitlements to transportation under the law and under your policy, and everybody has those rights. But students with disabilities might have extra entitlements. And how do you know that they receive those extra entitlements? They're recommended by the CSC or the 504 team, and they're in the plan. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. What are those extra entitlements? What are we talking about? How do they get there? So there are many, many possible transportation accommodations. Now, just so you know, if you look in the regs, you will not see a section going transportation accommodations. Here's a whole list of them. Does not exist. These accommodations have emerged over time through guidance documents, through practicality, and these are some of the favorites. But this list isn't complete. It's emerging. You might think of another accommodation that works. And I always give this example. There was a student who years ago could not behave. It was an autistic student and was having a hard time on the bus. It was a small bus, and somehow after a while they figured out the student likes country music, and the student behaved or didn't, was able to tolerate the bus ride. So literally there was accommodation saying play country music on the bus. Now, for me, country music, I have the opposite reaction. Like if I hear that, I'm gonna get aggravated. But so you just don't know what we're gonna come up with next. So some of the big ones, let's go. The Hall of Fame of Transportation Accommodations are door-to-door and curb-to-curb. Now, let's start with, remember we talked about entitlement and so on. So, well, let me take a step back. Door-to-door and curb-to-curb. The devil is in the details, and don't mix them up. Remember I always talk about don't say test mods when you mean test accommodations and so on. Door-to-door is literally up to the front door of the house. Curb-to-curb is the curb in front of the house. Big difference. There's a big difference. There's a whole, whatever it is, could be a sidewalk, could be a driveway. In some neighborhoods, it could be a quarter mile. And a little later, we're going to talk about doors in the apartment building. We'll talk about that, a little treat, a little sneak preview on that. So remember though, curb to curb, you might be providing curb to curb anyway under your policy. Now, some policies say, we'll pick you up in front of your house. Some policies say you have a bus stop, designated bus stops. And by the way, some schools aren't even following their own policies. Some schools say, we'll take you to a bus stop, but for whatever reason, they're dropping off every kid in front of their house. And this creates sort of bedlam when it comes to these rules. So I think might not be a bad idea to take a look exactly what your policy is. And if you think something's off, these policies could be changed. So take a look and see, make sure your practices are meeting your practices are meeting your policy. So why do some kids get door-to-door or curb-to-curb? So there's a couple of factors you can consider. This should be a disability-related accommodation. And we'll talk a little bit later about some cases which show that that's not always the case. But we're looking at obviously the disability, the age, how long a distance is it from the bus stop to the home or from the curb to the home? What's the area of travel? Is the bus stop 3 blocks away and is a nice sidewalk? Or is there's no sidewalk and the student has a wheelchair? What if it's through the woods? What if there's temporary construction? What if, what is the student's need for assistance? Is the student able to traverse location by themselves? So there's a lot of factors to consider on that. And there's a little, some of it's common sense, some of it's disability based, some of it's based on, trying to keep the students safe. And we're going to talk about a case on this in a minute. It's a pretty illustrative case. Last on in the morning, first off in the afternoon. That means this student should not ride the bus for that long. Well, why would we recommend that? Well, it's based on the student's ability to remain on the bus for long periods of time. How do you know this is necessary? Well, if after a while the student starts to misbehave or get frustrated or just cannot keep it together, and I think there's a much fancier term than cannot keep it together. Was it perseverate or so on? If they're having a hard time, then they shouldn't be on the bus that long. How do you know this is needed? Well, the easiest way is when the student gets to school in the morning, he or she is a mess and it's impacting their day. You'll know it. That's easy to identify. Sometimes you get everything's fine, but the parent says, oh, I got home and he had a meltdown. It's because of the bus. And that's where it gets confusing because we don't see that. And it gets into the issue of, are we supposed to do something in school to impact the home? And that's kind of a gray area as well. So you got to keep your eye on how the student is doing and can they tolerate it. Now, the thing is, though, what if you can accommodate this student? Going back to the country music example, maybe the student can tolerate the 30 minutes if there's another accommodation like access to an iPad, headphones, something like that. So you could have 2 accommodations, kind of counterintuitive. Sometimes sometimes this is a function of circumstances. So I like to give this example, and I don't really know. I love Rochester, and I know all of you, and I know the names of the districts. I have no idea where anything is in relation. I can get to any place, but if you told me which district is next to another, I'm not really sure. So I'm going to stick to Western New York. In Niagara County is about 45 minutes north of Buffalo. And there's a lot of kids in Niagara County who need out-of-district placements, and all of their placements are in Buffalo. That's a long bus ride. That's just bad luck for Niagara County. So they're going to get this problem a lot because they're going to get a 40-minute ride, even if it's solo. So your district around here, may or may not be near other placements. So some of you, this is not a problem at all. Others is a huge problem. Another thing is we're seeing more litigation on this issue. We're seeing claims. We had a case where someone said, I got to have 10 minutes. I want 10 minutes. And sometimes people use generalizations as opposed to specifics, saying, oh, students with autism, they can't tolerate something when that may not be specific. Bus aid. Some kids will need a one-on-one aid on the bus. There's several reasons for this. Most of them are going to be behavioral and safety. You could also have cognitive issues. Do you need a one-on-one aid? Do you need an aid just for the whole bus, a group aid. It's a tough circumstance. Nurse on the bus, we talked about before. If there's a chance we need medication on the bus, you're probably going to need a nurse on the bus. Your other plan would be to pull over and call 911. If you don't, if you have 5 minutes to act, that might not be a good idea. Specialized equipment, assistive, okay. Sometimes these are the extras that would perhaps make a bus ride tolerable. Air conditioning, students with medical needs, they have to be in air conditioning. So that could be put on a bus. Harnesses, seatbelts. A harness is not an aversive intervention. It is completely fair game if needed. So if a parent says, you can't put my child in a harness because it's a harness, that's not true. If we think it's needed, then we go with it. Motorized lift, some just to get on the bus, they'll need special access to get on a bus and get off a bus. And we talked about access to headphones and iPads. I'm not an expert, but that sounds like something to sort of keep the student's attention, maybe distract the student to tolerate the bus. So we've got these lots of all fair game for the bus. Let me just a couple of comments on some of this. We're going to talk about curb to curb for a minute. We talked about it before. Some relevant factors are the disability, the age, the distance, the area of travel, and another part is, is there a parent? Is there a crossing guard? Do we want the student with a disability to cross two major intersections without a crossing guard? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But when assessing the appropriateness of the decision, that's what the courts are going to look at. Some other factors, again, mobility. If this, again, a student in a wheelchair, students in crutches. What about the weather? They say that's not in here, but if you're in a bad weather area, you can anticipate it's going to be icy, snowy. If you're in Arizona, you might not have that issue. That's specific here. You're going to expect a student in crutches to get that far in the winter. Are there obstacles? Is it passable? Another is a student a flight risk? Do we think the student is going to bolt? Now and that's fair game, even for door to door. That might be a reason. Can you expect when the bus pulls up in the front of the curb, can we expect the student to get from the front door to the bus stop, or is he or she just going to take a dash? And it happens. And so this is how this is the relevant pieces. Private roads. This is another totally bad issue for school districts. And when I say that, we don't get any relief from the law here, or we get very little. So the existence of private roads can be very problematic. One issue, so you're pulling up to the cul-de-sac and there's a sign, it says private road. Can the bus go down? Well, not all private roads are the same. Some have exceptions. You need to look into it. Maybe the private road is private, but they allow deliveries. Maybe they allow bus stops. Don't assume it. Figure it out. Maybe you need permission. Well, you should, if you need permission from the co-op board, then we should ask for permission. Maybe the parent needs to participate in that process. Now, here, some private roads will allow certain size vehicles in, like only cars and vans. So if this is where it becomes tough. So let's say you have a fleet of 20 school buses and that's all you got. And the private road the private road will allow cars. can we say, well, we don't have a car, we're out of luck? We really can't say that. We're probably going to go shopping for a nice car. And you might say that's not fair, but let's go through the rationale here. You have a $50 million school budget, right? And it's all allocated. We don't have any extra money. So that's our defense, right? We don't have 20,000, 50,000 for a bus, for a minivan. That's not the logic the courts use. The logic under the ADA is how much is the cost versus your overall budget. So we won't get relief there. So there are circumstances where, you know, we may have to purchase a vehicle that's accessible. Now, kind of on that note, what if the district believes the road is not passable or is generally unsafe? Well, that's a possible basis for not having to go on the private road. However, we really got to prove it's unsafe. You need an expert. Maybe your transportation director is an expert, and he or she could say, this is not safe, not enough headway, it's prone to icing, stuff like that. The flip side is, once you go down that road, the outcome might be, well, it's not safe for your bus, but if you bought a Jeep, a 4x4, like this, you can get some crazy outcomes here where what are you you're gonna come up in a snowmobile and to pick up the kid, but that such an outcome, as silly as that sounds, isn't that far-fetched. Like, we're obligated to get the student, if we can, especially if transportation is on their IEP. This is where, again, the devil is in the details. Do you have a policy that says door to door? Or if the IEP says door to door, you got to get there. So something to think about. Maybe some schools have like the ski team. Imagine like you can get them, you know, the dog sleds and so on. Okay, let's talk about, do we have any questions? I had a couple of beeps. Okay, good. Oh, it's okay. Okay, we follow the decisions. We've been doing this so long. Usually when we see these new decisions, we're like, I've seen that before. I've seen that before. How many FAPE claims can you read about? Blah, blah, blah. How many, you know, what's that? Meaningful participation cases. We've seen them all. But sometimes you see a case and go, that's an interesting one. Well, sure enough, we actually had a curb-to-curb decision in federal court in New Jersey in June. So, the parents of a 9th grader with disabilities brought a claim because their request for curb-to-curb transportation was denied. Okay, so the district wanted the district's position was the student was fully capable of walking a few blocks to the bus stop. Parents sued federal court. So this student had numerous disabilities, including ADHD, learning disability, an unspecified neurodevelopmental disorder. The judge found, however, that the student did not have any physical or cognitive impairments that would prevent her from generally walking to the bus stop. Nevertheless, the judge ruled for the parents, and they said it would be unsafe for the student to walk to and from the bus stop due to the dangerous road conditions. So interesting. That has nothing to do with the disability, the dangerous road conditions, at least on its own or in a vacuum. But it just shows that the judges and the hearing officers are really going to focus on that, probably more than they should. So it becomes like a safety decision. So here's what the judge said. The bus stop was 1/3 of a mile from the student's home. That's a long walk. Although I used to walk to my school bus, it was about half a mile. So I had to go to so 1/3, that's not so bad. Now I'm no, my city bus. I had to go, it was, you know, so I didn't live on a bus route, so I had to walk a few blocks. So the student would have to traverse a busy, dangerous, steep mountain road. Where do they live? Mountain road. And the student would have encountered a blind curve. And at certain points, there would be no sidewalks or shoulders for pedestrians. This has nothing to do with students' disability. Although the judge implied that the above factors would be concerning for any student, she expressly noted that this student's psychological disabilities could increase the risks in this case. Kind of strange. I mean, I think that's a bit of a stretch. The judge also noted that all the other students in the area received curb to curb. That's interesting. And also, the student was entitled to transportation under the IEP because the child was placed in an out-of-district placement. So the district looked first, that was relevant too in the judge's eyes. Based on all the above, the district was ordered to provide curb to curb. So look, there's a lot to take out of this case. I mean, I think ultimately it's human reluctance to they don't want to be the one who says, I'm going to order you to walk, and God forbid something happens. You wonder how much that goes in. So that was an interesting decision. Just don't underestimate the safety factors. The next is something called porter services. So again, I grew up in New York City in an apartment building. The porter was someone who cleaned the building. That's what I thought. But that's the current version. But porter services apparently means something else. So we've got a case, New York City, my alma mater, New York State Department of Ed, from May 2024. The issue here is the parents said they wanted porter services for the student. What are porter services? That they are carrying a student from his internal apartment door, not external, internal door to the school bus. So what is this? This is going into the apartment building, crossing the line from the street, from outside to inside, meeting the student inside the building and escorting him to the bus. Now, I think a lot of people say you don't have to do that, right? You don't go into the apartment. So they brought the claim, and they brought it in the Southern District of New York, which is a trial court, the lowest level federal court, but it's in New York. And the court ruled for the district, said no, porter services are beyond the obligations under the IDEA and ADA. The district won. We got this one. High fives for the district, right? We don't have to go in. So we're feeling like, well, we got this one, not so fast, because the same issue came up in September in Washington, D.C., in another court. This is a higher court. This was the D.C. Circuit. So in federal court, you got your district court level trial courts, first level. Court of Appeals is 2, and then Supreme Court is 3. So this was an appeals court. Now, it's not in New York, so it doesn't have direct precedential value, but it's higher than the court in New York. So, and the DC Circuit, which, by the way, this is like a lot of people on the US Supreme Court go up through the DC Circuit. It's kind of cool. You'd be surprised. This is a big court. They ruled for the student on the same issue. They said, wait a minute. No, we're going to interpret the IDEA as including porter services. So this question is it's in flux. And I would be shocked if the parents in the first case in New York didn't appeal based on, they could point to another circuit court and say, they ruled for us. Pretty interesting. So now where does this go? Does that mean you have, that's an apartment building. Do you have to go into the home? Is that the next thing? Do porter services include going upstairs to the bedroom and taking the student down? We don't know. Hope not, but we don't know. So food for thought. A couple of other miscellaneous decisions. Okay. Use of a harness, we talked about before. It's well settled. We can use harnesses on buses, but and all the, when is a harness appropriate? Well, here's some language that courts have looked to. In Seattle, Washington, they said you could use a harness if there's a clear and present danger of serious harm to himself and others, as well as a danger of serious harm to property. So that's one standard. Another court, a high court, said you could use a harness because the behavioral outbursts pose a serious risk of bodily injury to the other passengers. So it's pretty high standard, but make sure you're following one of those standards. The devil is in the details. A recent decision from last year, a school got in hot water. They recommended a 5-point harness and used a 4-point harness. It was found to be out of compliance. So be careful. Just put harness. Or if you're going to put something like that level of specificity, you need to follow through on it. Now, what's the difference between those two? It beats me. But whatever you're putting in there, we own. Transportation, FBAs and BIPs, fair game, eminently appropriate. If a student is having issues behaviorally on a bus, it could lead to a removal. You should do an FBA. We're seeing an increase in this, FBAs and BIPs, and a lot of times these work. It's like you're cracking the code. How do we get through this bus ride? And you have an expert, a psychologist. A lot of these kids, maybe they're going to an agency placement. They might have someone there that can help with this. And if you're looking, this is a big deal. And what works in a school classroom might not be the different environment in a bus. So we'll go on. Also, small buses, remember least restrictive environment principles. Just like we can't put a student in a smaller class without exhausting all of our supports and services in a bigger setting. Same thing with buses. Before we put a student on the small bus, I hate to use that term, but it's literally, I'm talking about a smaller bus, a bus with a smaller number of kids in it, all with disabilities. Before you do that, you have to ask, is there a way to do this where we can make it work in a regular bus? And maybe some schools never do this. Some do it all the time. Whenever you're busing exclusively kids with disabilities, you're running a risk. Someone could bring this argument that segregation and so on. And I always say you shouldn't, and sometimes you get these, like if a bus is coming to pick up a child, with a disability, put the sibling on the bus too. I like that 1 or 2 siblings, non-disabled, changes the whole calculus of the setting. Time limits. There's a lot of myths about this. There's a law that authorizes districts to go up to 50 miles to go to a residential school, non-residential, and you can actually go further if you get permission. But the distance is not what's important. It's the number of minutes on the road. We talked about, first on, first off, last on, but there's no rule that says you cannot put a student on the bus for more than any specific time period. It's all case by case. Courts have found transportation to and from school for 60 minutes to be appropriate, even more than 60 minutes appropriate. But there may be instances when we feel it's too long. We talked about that before. And that's where you go. But a parent can't just say it's automatically too long. Even longer than 60 minutes could potentially be appropriate. Transportation contracts, sometimes we just can't do it. We don't have a bus. We don't have a driver. We don't have an aide. We don't have a nurse. Maybe nobody wants to transport the student. What do? Well, if you're fortunate, the parent will be amenable to transporting. And if you do, that's allowed, and it's easier than it used to be. So the old rule, some of you might be familiar with, in order to do this, you had to go through this process of putting out a bid and showing it the bid failed, and then we'd rig the bid so that nobody could possibly meet these, you need 7 years experience doing this, and you have to be available at 2:47 to 2, and they would never, nobody would bid for it. Then you'd have to get permission from the state, so on. You don't have to do that anymore. Under the new rule, 2021, NYSED no longer requires competitive bidding for this, which is great. If you do this, a couple of caveats on this are, you could only contract with the parents. You can't contract with grandma or Uncle Jed or the neighbor down the block. It's got to be a parent. And you're only allowed to compensate direct mileage. There's no hourly charge. It's got to be mileage. You don't pay for insurance, registration, repair costs. It's got to be mileage. And you could stack these payments up to like whatever the rate is set by the controller. So let's say it's 60 cents a mile. Ideally, you contract for 60 cents a mile, but you're not prohibited from agreeing to a higher amount. The parent might say, I'll do it, but I want $1. You can't, you might say, okay, done. A question? Hold on. Oh, I got it. It's like Dr. Phil. Okay.
Is it problematic for a district to contract with the parent only when the student is in the vehicle? So if we were just paying for the one-way trip when they're taking the student to school, but not the parent's return trip?
Great. That's a great question. The question was, when you contract, is it back and forth or just one way? And I think we would love it if you could say it's only one way. And if they agree to that, great. But people don't usually agree to that because they're going to say, what am I going to sit in the parking lot for 6 hours? But yeah, I know, and you're not prohibited from agreeing. It's reasonable and it's common to agree to go back and, it's a round trip in the morning, round trip in the afternoon. If you could contract out though, that would be great. And also on this note, as I'm walking here, you should have a written contract memorializing this arrangement. And so what do you put in that contract? And by the way, we'll help you with that. We have samples. We negotiate the terms. You want to put the rates, the distance. You want to make it very clear what we're agreeing to. And there might be proof of submission, attendance on certain dates and so on. So here's a question.
How if the student lives with and is in custody of a grandparent?
Sure. Well, a great question. I mean, my reading on this is it's got to be whoever is legally in the role of parent. So if the grandparent had custody to the point where we've enrolled the student through the grandparent, then they would be the parent. I mean, we'd have to look at the documents, but the grandparent would become the parent for all purposes. So in that case, we could do it. Okay, here we come. Boy, Dr. Phil gets a good workout.
For the small bus or vehicle, can principals put gen ed students on the small bus or vehicle because they have behavior concerns on a big bus?
It's for a gen ed student? I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'm starting to, I mean, the good news is that how would the gen ed student have a right to challenge that? I mean, they couldn't, but I'm nervous about kind of lumping in the disabled kids and the problematic. I try to throw in a couple of kids who are well behaved in that bus too, to kind of mix it up, because I don't want to have. I'd be concerned to sort of, especially with some of the kids on that. They might have behavioral related special ed needs too. So to mix that all up, I'd be a little leery of doing that. And I'm curious, where's Anne? She left? Okay, did she? No, right, yeah.
My question has to do with our business officials giving us a difficult time around contracts for parents to transport kids. So any language that you could give us to give them, to move them along a little faster would be great.
Well, what's the problem? Why is it?
We're told that it's a very lengthy process to have a contract with the family. It needs to be done at the beginning of the year. You can't do it in the middle of the year. We really don't want to do it. Is there something else you can do? We're not doing it.
Okay, well, okay, yeah. Well, I mean, we'd have to specific circumstances. I mean, obviously there's an obligation to transport, and if you can transport under your normal procedures, then you wouldn't want to consider the contract. So but if you truly can't transport and you're unable to, if you're in a circumstance where you can't transport the student, like you can't find an aide, you don't have a bus, and someone objects to this, then I guess you're just not going to transport the student, and you pick your poison. So I think we need to discuss the specific circumstances, but this is a safety measure when you cannot transport a child. If you can transport, you probably shouldn't be doing this. And I think somebody who was auditing the district, and if they said, why'd you enter this contract? You could have transported through your own people. They may have a good point there.
We're going to talk about the exciting world of assistive technology. So I find in general that every district is managing assistive technology slightly differently. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. Number one, it's not like a certified position, assistive technology. There isn't a definition in the law for who does it. And it's unclear at times what district's responsibilities are, but there are some legal requirements that we're going to discuss today. And we're also seeing assistive technology being raised a lot in requests for due process. And it tends to be one of those low-hanging fruit allegations because districts frequently don't understand the legal obligations that they have around assistive technology. And parent attorneys know that. And so they raise that. And so hopefully we can be better able to defend after learning this information, but also probably more importantly, improve some procedures if that's needed in your district around assistive technology. So under the IDEA, the CSE may be required to consider special factors in the development of students' IEP, and that would include assistive technology. And we have that section in the IEP about special factors, and you click the boxes, and assistive technology is one of those boxes. And if a student requires assistive technology, to receive a FAPE, a free appropriate public education, it is the district's responsibility to provide that assistive technology to the student in accordance with their IEP. Something that I see come up a lot are parents, especially for augmentative communication devices, assistive augmented, AAC devices. Parents are going through insurance to get those devices. And sometimes they're even asking districts to write justification letters for that purpose. And I think that that's very risky because we have our own independent legal obligation to identify if a student needs an AAC device or any kind of assistive technology, and if so, to provide that. So if we're writing a letter saying the student needs it, but we're not providing it, that could be used as evidence against us that we're failing to provide that free appropriate public education. And it can also be an issue if the parents have to go out and get their own device. Now, parents like this because they get a lot of control over what that device is. And I understand that, but that's kind of not our problem. Our problem is to identify if the student needs a device, and if so, provide that device. So an assistive technology device is any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a student with a disability. It does not include a medical device that is surgically implanted or the replacement of such a device. So the definition is very broad for what can be considered assistive technology that a district might be responsible to provide. And assistive technology services are separate from a device. Those are services that assist a student with a disability in the selection, acquisition, or use of an assistive technology device. It could include an evaluation of needs of a student with a disability, including a functional evaluation of the student in the student's customary environment. It can include purchasing, leasing, or otherwise providing for the acquisition of assistive technology, selecting, designing, fitting, customizing, et cetera, any kind of device, coordinating and using other therapies or interventions or services with assistive technology. We see this a lot with speech therapy, with AAC devices, training or technical assistance for a student with a disability, or if appropriate, that student's family, and training and technical assistance for professionals who are working with the student. These are all things that if a child needs a device or some kind of assistive technology that the CSE should consider. What other types of supports should we put in place to help the student access that and to help the adults around the student support the student around the assistive technology? Something else that's very important are assistive technology evaluations. And we're going to get to that more specifically, but just as a precursor, a lot of districts are not doing formal assistive technology evaluations. If a student needs assistive technology, a lot of districts might put something on there like a consult to try to trial some assistive technology devices. And that's okay. That's really the way that we should be trialing assistive technology, but we do need to conduct an evaluation when we're considering a student's assistive technology needs. And that evaluation would be subject to an independent educational evaluation, an IEE. Parents frequently ask for assistive technology IEEs, and frequently when that comes up, the district has not conducted their own evaluation to begin with. So if your district doesn't have a procedure in place to conduct assistive technology evaluations, I strongly suggest that you put that in place, that you identify who at the district might have some expertise that they can develop around that so that they can lead those evaluations. Or that you can contract out, maybe through BOCES or through an agency. You don't have to do it internally, but you need to have access to students being able to have an assistive technology evaluation. The purpose or goal of assistive technology is to facilitate student independence as they work towards their academic, social communication, occupational, and recreational goals. We see this becoming increasingly more important as students progress through the grades. So if a student has a significant reading disability in the younger grades, the focus might be very much on giving them reading intervention to try to improve that. As they get older, that reading intervention might still be important, but we should also consider, is there assistive technology that we can provide to them so that they can have more independence around their reading, so that when they leave us and go to post-secondary activities, that they are able to access those accommodations and know how to use them so that they can be more independent. Some CSE considerations from the federal regulations. They have, quote, CSE must consider whether the child needs assistive technology devices and services. In New York State, there's additional consideration regarding the student's access to school purchased assistive technology outside of school. So the CSE has an obligation to consider if the student needs assistive technology, and if so, do they need that outside of school as well? The CSE must recommend and provide assistive technology devices or services if they are deemed necessary. The services that we see a lot are assistive technology consultation. We need to make sure the student knows how to use the device and some support around that. And some assistive technology consult is a good way to go about that. The recommendation has to be included on the student's IEP. It has to be provided at no cost to the parent, including the evaluations. And the district may deny a parent's request for a specific assistive technology device and still provide the student a free appropriate public education. So we're not automatically required necessarily to say, okay, if the parent wants a specific device, but if we're going to deny it, it's better to have data around that. So some kind of evaluation that measures the need for that device. And if we agree that a student has a need for that type of technology, but maybe not that specific device, that's also something for the CSE to consider. The least restrictive environment is our obligation to educate students in the as close to the general education setting as possible. And when we're considering a more restrictive placement for a student than their current placement, we have an obligation to exhaust any supplementary aids or supports that we can before we move them to something more restrictive. And assistive technology is one of those considerations for the CSE to make. So if the CSE is considering a more restrictive placement for a student, the CSE should engage in a conversation about whether all of the supplementary aids and supports available have been used and haven't worked. And that should consider talking about, is there any assistive technology that we have implemented or that we can consider implementing before we go more restrictive. It doesn't mean that you always have to give assistive technology before you go more restrictive. It just means you need to consider if there might be assistive technology available that you should try first. It is possible for the CSE's failure to recommend an assistive technology device or service to be considered a denial of a free appropriate public education. That's only if the devices and services are required for the student to access their education program. So if we do deny a parent's request, or if we determine that a student doesn't need assistive technology, be sure you clearly identify that in the prior written notice letter and explain the reason for that denial. The failure to promptly provide an assistive technology device that's recommended by the CSE could be a FAPE denial. So if the CSE put a device on there and it takes you several months to get that device, that alone could result in the district being found to fail to have provided a FAPE. And in New York, assistive technology services are considered to be related services, so they are part of the student's special education. There is kind of a wacky rule under the that's a legal term, wacky rule, under the Americans with Disabilities Act that gives primary consideration to the parents around certain assistive technology that's needed for hearing, vision, or speech disabilities. This doesn't come up that much. This is separate from CSE. It's under a different law, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it requires us to ensure that students with disabilities are able to communicate with their fellow students and staff members as effectively as their peers. And it requires us to provide auxiliary aids and services that are not required under the IDEA to meet effective communication requirements in certain situations. So we might have an obligation above what the IDEA would require to provide these devices to assist students with communication. And we might have an obligation to allow parents to have that primary consideration in choosing what that device would be for their child. Like I said before, we are required to conduct evaluations when we're considering a student's need for assistive technology, just like any other related service. Remember, it's a related service. We wouldn't provide speech language therapy without a speech evaluation. We shouldn't consider assistive technology without an assistive technology evaluation. That is the first step. And I personally don't believe that a consult on an IEP is necessarily sufficient to be considered that evaluation. I think the consult is a good idea. I'm not telling you not to do that, but I'm saying in addition to that, we should do an evaluation. Denial of an evaluation could impact our ability to provide a free, appropriate public education for a student. And we should not rely on a parent's rejection of a specific device as a basis for not conducting an assistive technology evaluation. If there's any question if a student needs assistive technology, the first step should be to do an evaluation. And then the CSE reviews that evaluation and identifies if the student requires a device or service. As far as substantive requirements in an evaluation, like I said earlier, there's no specific credentials required to conduct assistive technology evaluations or to provide assistive technology services to students in New York State. We see this taken up by a lot of related service providers. So frequently speech language therapists, occupational therapists, just by nature of what they do, sometimes they're just more inclined to know more about this. I've seen special education teachers do this. It does require the district to consider some professional development for that person if needed to help them become more familiar with their obligations to do these evaluations to make sure that there's a formal procedure in place. There is a link here of an assistive technology consideration checklist from SCD that provides more information to help the CSE navigate through that. Now, assistive technology is not typically do an evaluation, identify the service or the device, and you're good to go forever. It's usually evolving as students' needs evolve, as technology evolves. This could change over time, which is one of the reasons that I really like consults, because that can help monitor those changing needs. But we should have a process in place where identifying if we should be trying different devices, if maybe a certain device isn't working for a student, if software has changed in some way, where we can modify this and adjust as needed. A surgically implanted medical device is not considered to be a related service. It's not assistive technology that the district is required to provide. So this could be something like a cochlear implant. It could be something like a pacemaker. It could be any device that's surgically implanted. That is not the school district's responsibility. But the school district would be responsible to monitor and maintain medical devices needed to maintain the health and safety of the child, or to routinely check an external component of a surgically implanted device to make sure it is functioning appropriately. So we do need to give some support around that if that would be necessary at school, but we don't have to pay for or identify that the student needs a surgically implanted device. Beware of putting specific software or applications on an IEP because you don't know how things might change. There's typically a few different types of software or application that might work. So I would be, I recommend putting something like speech to text software, describing what the software does instead of the name of an actual program that you're going to buy. And parents sometimes really want certain types of programs, software, applications. If that happens, the CSE needs to consider that request. But you don't need to grant it if the student doesn't need that specific software to be able to receive a free, appropriate public education. And it would be unusual that a student needs a very specific software to receive that FAPE. It could happen, I suppose, but it's unusual. So I suggest that you describe the type of service, device, software, et cetera, but you don't get specific about the program, the company that publishes that device, software, whatever it is. And there was a decision out in Ohio where the district was found to be out of compliance with the student's IEP because it recommended a specific app on the student's IEP, and that app no longer functioned on the district's network. So there were other apps that could have been used, but they recommended a specific app. It couldn't be used at the district, and that was a compliance issue for the IEP. By the way, that whole don't recommend something specific kind of applies to everything. So you see that come up with reading methodology a lot. There are certain independent evaluators that are very focused on certain reading programs. Parents sometimes get very focused on certain reading programs. So you might see a parent want Orton Gillingham or Wilson, or there's all different types of reading programs. When a parent raises a specific methodology to the CSE needs to consider if the student needs that methodology to receive a FAPE. So we shouldn't just say, no, we don't put methodology on an IEP. We should have a conversation around that. If everybody across the table at CSE agrees that that's the only methodology that could address a student's needs, then that methodology should go on the IEP. But I don't know, after 15 years between chairing CSE meetings and being a school attorney, that I've ever come across that, where everybody agreed that there was only one methodology that could definitely work for the student. And so if that's not the situation, where the CSE says this is the only thing that could work, we have no legal obligation to put the methodology on the IEP. And the law actually says that it's the teacher or the service provider's professional judgment that determines how to address the student's needs. And what it comes down to in that situation are the student's IEP goals. The goals drive the instruction. So when a parent says, I really want Wilson, my kid has dyslexia, I really want Wilson on my student's IEP. The CSE, if they don't believe that Wilson is necessary, the only program that would work, should lead the discussion to, well, what are your concerns? What are the goals that we should be working on? And identifying, does a student have decoding goals? Does the student have fluency goals, as we would expect students with dyslexia to have? And if so, we need to make sure we have very specific, individualized, measurable goals around those needs. And that will drive the instruction that the teacher will have to implement in order to address those goals. It'll frequently be a program like Wilson or a methodology like Wilson, because that's designed to address that. But we don't have to get specific about that methodology on the IEP. Any questions about that? As far as the IEP information and implementation, it has to describe the assistive technology and services. Again, talk about the function of the device rather than the actual type of device, the actual model, or what's the word I'm looking for? Model of the device, this type of you know what I'm saying. No. Brand. Thank you. That was the word I'm looking for, rather than the brand. If needed, provide training and assistance to the student, teachers, and parents. Consider what individuals will be responsible for providing or supporting the student's access. If you have a student who's in a gen ed setting, who's using pretty intense reading software, you need to make sure that the gen ed teacher knows about that and knows how to use it and help the student with that, because typically they wouldn't know unless we provide some support around that. We also need a plan for maintaining the device, training, monitoring of its use. And we need to have some kind of plan for getting the device and customizing it and having that ready before the IEP is implemented. That's important. We don't want to delay in that implementation. The CSE also has to consider if a student requires home-based assistive technology, and we only provide that on there if the student needs it to receive that free appropriate public education. And this can get confusing. So some ways that I've seen it come up, and it shouldn't be an automatic no, the CSE should consider on an individual student basis. So sometimes it comes up if the student is doing homework and they need their device to be able to use their homework. If the student uses a device for writing support and their homework involves writing, they're going to need that device at home so that they can do their homework. We also see it with AAC devices. If a student is using an AAC device for language And if they need to be able to practice that in different settings in order to receive that free appropriate public education, then it should be clicked on there that that device will go home with the student. Again, an individual student need. Maybe the student's first year with the AAC device, it doesn't go home because they're still learning how to use it. They're not ready to generalize that. But maybe as they get more used to it and they're getting better at using it, that's the time that we consider it goes home. It's an individual decision for the student, and it's made by the CSE. And if we do say that the device needs to go home, we need to make sure the device goes home with the student. And that means all the stuff that goes along with that, which means maintaining it. If it's broken, if it's lost, we're ultimately responsible for fixing it or replacing it. A lot of districts have that allow all students to bring their devices home, regardless of if it's on their IEP or not, have agreements that they have parents and students sign that say if the device is lost or broken, that they're responsible for paying for it, or that the student might not be permitted to bring it home if that happens. We can't really apply that if the student needs that device to receive that free appropriate public education. So something to think about. Devices, and it came up a lot with remote learning and with COVID, and we're seeing remote learning still being a thing because for students who are on tutoring for whatever reason, maybe for discipline, maybe because we can't find a program for them, which, you know, I don't like, but I know it happens. We often provide the tutoring through remote learning because it's very hard to find people to actually provide the service. But it's important when we're considering remote learning, when a student is at home, if the student is actually able to access that due to their disability. So there's two different issues. There's one, and this applies to all students regardless of disability status. Do they have the technology they need to be able to do it? If not, we need to provide them that. But specifically for students with disabilities, we need to identify whether they're able to access remote learning or if they have any disability related barriers to that. So students with more significant disabilities are likely not going to be able to sit independently at the computer and engage in remote learning with a tutor. But ultimately, if there's any question in this decision, it was found that the district should have conducted an assistive technology evaluation to identify if the student was able to access remote learning due to the student's disability related needs. And if the student was not, if there was any device or software or other support that the district needed to provide for the student to be able to access that. Again, this should be controlled by the CSE. The CSE might have enough information to know if it will work or not, but if there's any question, we should do an evaluation around that. All right, and now we're just going to summarize some different decisions and guidance documents that are out there for assistive technology. There was the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, which is through the Federal Education Department. This year issued a Dear Colleague letter, and it said that the CSE should consider the student's need for assistive technology devices and services every time it convenes to initially develop or review an IEP. So they're saying that should be part of our annual review process. We should talk about assistive technology for every student. Do they need it or not? That's what the education department is recommending, is guiding us to do. And this decision from 2019, the decision was the CSE should convene to update the student's IEP and consider appropriate assistive technology services whenever a student rejects them. And they found that the district erred by failing to convene the CSE after the student refused to use voice-to-text applications and a scribe listed in the IEP. We obviously cannot force a student to use assistive technology. We can make it available to them. We can help talk with them about why it's important. We can give them instruction and support around using it, but we can't force them to use it. And if they are not using, if they're declining the assistive technology, that's really good data for us, especially if they're doing fine. So if they decline the assistive technology, they're progressing in the curriculum, they're passing their tests, it seems like they're doing fine. That's an indication for the CSE that maybe they don't need it. That could be a reason to remove it. But if they're not doing fine, if they're struggling, and if we identify as a CSE that the assistive technology is necessary, then we need to figure out other ways to support the student to help them use the technology. We need to find out what the barrier is for the student. We need to find out if there's other technology they might be more open to. Are there other ways we can support them to help them use it? A school district's delay in providing assistive technology on a student's IEP or failure to maintain or repair assistive technology could be a FAPE denial. And we can't tell you, everybody always wants, well, how long do we have? Do we have a month to put it in place? Do we have 6 weeks? How long do we have? And the answer is always, it depends. But here's a few different cases that give us an idea. So this first case, the 16-week delay in replacing a tablet was a FAPE denial for a student with visual needs. Student was not able to access their education without this because of their vision needs. The district waited 4 months. That was a FAPE denial. And this other decision from 2015, a 1-month delay in replacing laptop software resulted in a FAPE denial for a student with a disability who used his laptop to complete assignments. Sometimes we have no control over these delays. It takes a long time to get some of this. We have to go through purchasing orders. We have to wait for it to be delivered. We need to plan ahead for all of that and think about, are there backups that we can put in place while we're waiting for this particular student? But in this next case in Buffalo, OCR found that a 2-week delay in enabling a student to begin to use a smart pen due to technical difficulties did not result in a FAPE denial. So a lot of times it depends on what's the purpose of the assistive technology. The student's still able to access the curriculum, do their work without it. It's probably less of an issue if there's a very slight delay than if they need that to be able to access their education. But try not to delay. Again, assistive technology is an accommodation, so it should not be designed to modify an assignment or interfere with the district's ability to monitor the student's progress with respect to a specific need. So it's not a modification, it's an accommodation that's provided to assist them with accessing their education. And a spell check device or program is not an appropriate accommodation if spelling is a precise skill to be tested. And that's what we see with a lot of these decisions. So when we're giving assistive technology, the student is not entitled to that if it's going to address whatever we're assessing. So if it's a spelling test, we wouldn't give student a spell check device. And that's something that you can be specific about on the student's IEP when you're talking about the conditions that this will be used. You could say in all assignments and assessments except those measuring spelling. You could say something like that. And there have been some OCR decisions on this. In this 1991 decision, OCR said that a district appropriately prohibited the use of an automated spell check device for students with dyslexia, taking the state's academic skills program test for college entrance because part of what it was measuring was spelling. And so it's okay to not provide assistive technology when the skill being assessed is what the assistive technology is designed to assist with. And in this other case, a hearing officer ruled that a district was not required to provide a learning disabled student with a spell check and grammar check computer programs during a senior writing proficiency examination, because the purpose of that examination was to measure spelling and grammar. The same principle also applies to calculators. So if the student has a calculator on their IEP, and if the purpose of a math test or a math assignment isn't to measure their simple calculation, but maybe something like algebra problems or geometry or something like that, then they can use the calculator for that. But if the purpose of it is to measure math computations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, if that's the objective of the test, then that would be a reason to not provide the calculator. I think there's always more cover if you specify these conditions on the IEP.
So thank you. Related, unrelated is if students are not using spell check for essays, for sort of standardized or local tests, if we're not allowing that because we want to see their proficiency, we have families that push back then and request spelling waived because the ultimate grade from that project or assessment will impact their grades. What are your thoughts on spelling waived?
I've seen spelling waived on a lot of different plans. I think it's okay to put it on there, but I think, again, we need to think about, do they need that to receive that free appropriate public education? Or is the purpose of the grade, it depends on what the purpose is of having spelling count in the curriculum and if they need the accommodation. It's not an automatic yes or automatic no.
Okay, so you spoke a lot to the CSC process. Was this applied to 504 as well?
Yes. Yes, it all applies to 504. Because assistive technology in New York is considered a related service and an accommodation, both of those are fair game under section 504, so it applies there as well.
Not a spelling question, but I have a student that is homeschooled, so with an IESP, not immunized, so the family will not let providers come in the home. They will only allow speech services virtually. But now they're requesting an AT eval for a communication device, but do not want somebody in the home to complete that.
Yeah, so the AT eval would be fair game. I think that requests for evaluations in general should be granted unless there's some kind of circumstance. Maybe we've already done the evaluation and we don't think there's a need to update it. But in general, it's always safer to honor a request for an evaluation. If a student's unimmunized, it cannot take place at the school or any building in the district. So the evaluation would either have to take place in the home or some kind of third-party location if there's an agency that can do the eval for you and they can take the student there. Or if there's a way to do it remotely, we should do the best we can under the circumstances, given the parameters the family is putting on us. And then the determination about if the student needs the device is based on the evaluation. And they could, especially if they're getting speech therapy, that could be something that they receive. It depends on the circumstances. But kids that are homeschooled are not entitled to a free appropriate public education. The legal standard for those students is that we provide services on an equitable basis. And we're not really sure what that means, except that it's less than a FAPE, but it's still something. But if a student has a speech impairment and needs an AAC device, that's probably fair game for a homeschooled student. Other questions? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to pass it off to Andrew. Thanks, everybody.
It's okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Andrew from the Buffalo office. I'm here in defense of country music. So I'm a country music convert. Actually, my wife, big country music fan, big Tim McGraw fan. Any Tim McGraw fans out there? But anyway, I will say on behalf of country music, one of the last genres to actually have musicians play. Now, I don't think 16-year-old Andrew probably would not believe what just came out of my mouth. You know, a lot of Beastie Boys back in the day, but it's not so bad. But anyway, like I said, I'm happy to be here. I don't get to speak to the Rochester audience much. Hopefully I'll be allowed back after what I just said, but I'm happy to be here. Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I've been with Jeff and Ann for about 5 years now. Prior to becoming an attorney, I was actually a teacher. I was a music teacher. I taught band actually at a charter school in Buffalo for about 10 years. And then for some reason or another went to law school. But that's a very long story. But anyway, we got about 10 minutes. Forgive me if I go a few minutes over to talk about transition services. Frankly, this is almost a forgotten part of the IEP process. I think in the 5 years, in fact, in the 5 years that I've been with Jeff and Ann, I don't know that I've seen a due process complaint involve complaint regarding transition services. I'm sure it does come up, frequently, obviously, on the day-to-day, but I don't know that I've seen a complaint involving this. But so, in light of that, we've got recent changes to FAPE in terms of up until the age of 22 rather than 21. And, some of you who may just deal with elementary students may not be familiar with these or less familiar with these than some of your colleagues. So we thought it'd just be a good opportunity to do an overview and a refresher and to talk about this process. So here we go. All right. So we're talking about taking students who are exiting high school and preparing them for life after high school. We have, that's really the function of school in general, right? To prepare students, all of our students, gen ed students, special ed students, for being functional members of society in some way, shape, or form. So we have an obligation to do that under the law, through the IDEA. So transition services really, it's just a plan included in the student's IEP to help prepare them for post-secondary life, what life will be after high school. So, within that plan, we have to come up with, statements regarding what their preferences and interests are, and come up with a coordinated set of activities designed to support the student's movement from school to post-school activities. And that is a range of things. Post-secondary education, that could be a 4-year college, it could be 2-year college, vocational training, integrated employment, competitive employment, meaning, employment for pay or supported employment, or community, living in a community home, trying to get them prepared for independent living. The range of disability, obviously there's a range of needs among our students, so not every student is going to have the same goal. Now, this is really driven by the preferences and needs, strengths and preferences of the student. So what are we talking about when we say coordinated set of activities? This is right from the regulations. A set of activities must be based on the student's strengths and preferences and interests, and shall include needed activities in the following areas. So these are the areas where we need to consider. We're not necessarily going to come up with recommendations for all of these, but these are the areas at least that we should be considering during this process. So instruction, what kind of coursework will we need to get this student to achieve his or her post-secondary goals, related services, if any community experiences that we should be thinking about, perhaps placement in a job site program, development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives. Maybe one of the objectives is to figure out how to navigate public transportation, how to work and live independently. And when appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills and provision of a functional vocational evaluation. So not every student, we're going to need to consider the acquisition of daily living skills. Those would be for our students who are, have some more severe challenges. But when we're talking about this, we're thinking about what are the kinds of things we need to recommend to get students to achieve their post-secondary goals. So how do we figure out how to develop these goals, and what kinds of services are we thinking about? Well, this is when you read the guidance and you read the regulations, it's clear this is a very, for the most part, student-driven process. So we have to be giving assessments in that regard. And this process actually starts rather early. So under New York State regulations, we require that we start talking to students at the age of 12 about what their interests are. So the regulations say specifically age 12, and those refer to special education for the first time, or 12 and over, shall receive an assessment that includes a review of school records, teacher assessments, so we're talking to teachers, parent and student interviews to determine their vocational skills, aptitudes, and interests. So this is not really a formal thing, but we need to be having those discussions and start talking about that, so that when we get to the real process, and I'm saying, like, using that term loosely, the real process when we turn 15. So under the IDEA, we have to start this process sort of quote unquote officially at the age of 16. New York, always one-upping the federal government, has said that we need to start this process at age 15. So beginning not later than the first IEP to be in effect when the student is age 15 and younger if appropriate, and updated annually, we have to include certain things regarding this transition plan. So number one, we have to include a statement of the student's needs, including the strengths, preferences, and interests as they relate to transition from school to post-school activities. So how do we figure out what the students' needs are? I mean, we do evaluations where we generally know how to determine what the students' needs are. And in terms of preferences and interests, I mean, we have to give also assessments that are, those assessments don't necessarily look like the traditional assessments. There's no like specific way that these look, and we'll have a slide at the end that will have a link to some of what these assessments will look like. But we need to start figuring out, okay, what are the students' interests and goals after high school? Now, some of our students will be able to articulate those just fine. Some of our students will not be able to. Some of our students are nonverbal, non-ambulatory. That can be a real challenge. Now, when that happens, generally, you're going to start leaning more heavily on input from the parents and caregivers to, the folks who are working with that student, who know that student best. I've also seen, to the extent you can, trying to give assessments in a way like putting them in a room where that they are responsive and maybe flourished, for lack of a better word. But there are creative ways to do that. So we do need to be thinking about how can we try best to get the preferences and interests of that student. We can't just throw up our hands in the air and say, well, they can't communicate. We may need to be more creative. So those assessments will form that statement, and also develop we have to include appropriate measurable post-secondary goals based upon those assessments. And the goals that we need to develop are in these three areas: training, education, and employment, and if appropriate, living skills. So how do we determine? I mean, schools can determine from inputs on the parents and agency representatives, what kinds of assessments to do. Now, how often do we need to do that? Well, we have to do it, first of all, beginning at the age of 15. Now, everybody knows that a student's interest, if we're talking about, just generally speaking, your interest can change from age 15 to when you graduate high school. So doing this one time is not going to be sufficient. And, when you talk to a student at age 15, they might not know what exactly they want to do. So in those cases, the goal, maybe the goal starts off as, after graduation high school, we'll enroll in a four-year college of the student's choice. And maybe by the time they graduate high school, will enroll in a four-year college and obtain a bachelor degree in English and obtain certification to be a teacher. So there's going to be some growth here, and that's okay. But I think the point is really just to keep an eye on it. It's not a one-shot deal. Okay, you have these conversations as you're preparing for the annual review when you have students of this age. Now, these goals apply whether or not the requirement to develop these goals applies whether or not the skill levels related to training and education employment are age appropriate. So generally speaking, we have to develop the goals in these areas for every student. Generally speaking, now there are situations where employment may not be a realistic possibility, and that we understand, but just generally speaking, their employment is a range of things, right? So employment can be, a career, or employment can be, a day program where they're completing daily tasks. So a little out of the box thinking in terms of what employment actually looks like. Let's see. And like I said, the goal should be, our annual goals in our IEP concern what we want the student to achieve during their time in school. Okay, the goals in a transition plan need to reflect the students what life will be like after high school. So, for example, like I already gave the example of graduating high school and enrolling in college. Like in terms of daily living skills, the student will work and live independently and be able to take public transportation. Those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And lastly, we need to include a statement on the student. I'm sorry, I don't think that's last, but we also need to include a statement of the student's courses of study, such as participation in advanced placement courses or vocational education program. What are the courses? What are the services essentially that we need to get this student to achieve his or her goals? Okay, so I also, again, needed activities to facilitate the student's movement. All right, what activities are we going to recommend to help the student achieve this goal? Are we going to recommend placement in a jobs program? We have to be thinking about also, we have a responsibility to partner with community, agencies and things like that to give our students a range. So, because some students will know exactly what they want to do, some will not. So giving students the range of experiences will help inform your ability to help plan and create those transition plans. And we could talk about a case that's relevant later on. So also we need to include a statement of the responsibilities of the school district and, when applicable, participating agencies for the provision of such services and activities. So we have to say who's going to be responsible for what. So for example, if the student is going to be placed in an agency or with OPWDD, we need to include a statement that that agency be financially responsible, or who's going to be responsible for providing such services after high school. All right. Other requirements when we start talking about transition planning at CSA meetings, I would expect that for the most part, we're going to be doing this at our annual review at least to ensure appropriate transition planning and development of goals. We also have to have a discussion with the parents about what the requirements are to graduate high school. They're the graduation requirements that apply to the student depending on the year in which they first enter grade 9. So the graduation requirements that apply to the student specifically, how the student is progressing toward receipt of a diploma, the courses they've passed, the number of credits they have and earned, and the assessments required for graduation that the student has taken and passed. So you're just giving a breakdown. What do we need to graduate? Where's the student in that process? Now we'll talk later on that, the graduation requirements in New York may be changing at some point down the road. But for the time being, we have the rules of what they are. So we need to be discussing those and, having a discussion about where we are in this process at our CSE meetings. We also need to discuss the appeal safety net and superintendent options that may be available, depending on the appropriateness of the situation. May do it on time. Okay, we're a little over, so I'm going to go quicker. Take my time. Jeff's given me the okay to take my time. I'm going to listen to Jeff. Okay, so now in addition to discussing that, having that breakdown, okay, we need to give the parents written information. Okay, this is a legal requirement that we also give. We have to provide written information explaining those graduation requirements, and which includes an eligibility criteria and the processes for seeking an appeal to graduate with a lower score in a Regents. Okay, we have to give parents written information about these different pathways and different options. We also have to explain under what circumstances the right or the entitlement to a FAPE terminates. So we have to explain that the right to a FAPE terminates upon graduation with a Regents diploma, or when they reach the age that eligibility ceases. So is that 21 or 22? Used to be 21. Second Circuit has ruled, and we generally are advising our clients that it is 22. There's some disagreement between a state court and the Second Circuit decision that needs to be ironed out still. But SED guidance also kind of aligns itself, not surprisingly, with that Second Circuit decision. So it is the age of 22. Now, well, I'll save that because we'll get to that again later. All right. Now, in terms of who must attend, all right, we always have requirements regarding who must attend. When we're talking about transition services and transition planning at our annual reviews or otherwise, we must invite the student. That's just an affirmative obligation. You must invite the student, irrespective of whether or not the student is capable of contributing, or irrespective of whether the student will comprehend really what's going on. Now, the student may not attend, that's okay, but we must give notice of the meeting and we must invite. Now, if the student does not attend, we still have to take other affirmative steps to ensure that their preferences and interests are being considered. So if the student's not there, who are we talking to most likely? The parents, right? Parents, caregivers, teachers who are working closely with that student. And that's also where you'll lean on those assessments that will have been given as well. Okay. Now, just like if you're considering an out-of-district placement, if appropriate, if a student is going to be placed in an agency, or if an agency is going to be responsible for providing services, or for that student after high school, we need to invite a representative of that agency. And the rationale makes sense, right? We need somebody there who's knowledgeable about the services that will be provided, knowledgeable about those processes, things like that. Just like if you were considering an out-of-district placement. Now, the one thing that's very important about that is before that person shows up, we have to obtain parental consent for that to happen. Okay, there's still laws in place. Obviously, everybody knows FERPA, Section 2D, data, student or laws that govern disclosure of students' personally identifiable information. So make sure that you get that consent before we invite that person or that person shows up. Okay. Other requirements, as students are preparing to exit, we need to prepare a student exit summary, which is a document essentially that summarizes, what their skills and abilities are, what their limitations are, and it gives recommendations to support their transition from high school to after high school. Now, there's a good guidance document on the State Education Department's websites from 2017, but it's very helpful. It gives great examples of the kinds of things that you consider, support strategies and accommodations for students to be successful, their academic skills and needs, interpersonal skills, things like that. Now, one of the primary purposes you'll see, this has a lot of functions, but one of the functions is like if a student is going on for employment or college education, this can help establish their need for accommodations at those places. Not really much else to say about that. So we need to make sure that we're giving this prior to exiting school, generally in the final year of high school, but before they exit. And so that, exiting school could be when they graduate with a diploma or when they exit school because they've reached the age that FAPE eligibility ends. So, and again, we're talking about in New York now, the day, is it the day after they turn 22? Like the day of their 22nd birthday? You remember exactly, like the day they turn 22. So that full day where they turn 22. But, SED guidance would say, and we would generally recommend the end of the school year in which they turn 22. Yeah, it's not required. SED would like us to do that, but it's not required. Okay. So again, and this is not just in SED would also say that, just if exiting school just in general. So that's with a CDOS or a skills achievement commencement credential. Okay. If they're exiting school in New York, we need to give them an exit summary. All right. So these are the key elements of successful transition plans. Keep in mind the goal of the transition plan is to identify and provide students with opportunities and necessary supports while they're in school that will help them achieve their secondary goals. Keep in mind the process of transition planning is collaborative effort, requires partnership among the student, family, and school as appropriate, other agencies who may be involved in providing services to the student, and it is ongoing across multiple years. And we mentioned that earlier. And the provision of meaningful and effective transition services requires the district to have appropriate instructional, career, and work-related community experiences available to students. And we talked about that too. We have an obligation to make sure that we can provide a range of activities. Now, we don't have an obligation to train them for what they want to do. If they want to become a baker, we don't need to give them a placement that's specific to just commercial baking. So for example, there's a case that I read where that wasn't really the parent's argument. The student had an interest in baking, but the district satisfied their obligation because, among other things, they placed her in a program that gave her opportunities to work in a kitchen and cook and do things like that. But they also that placement also gave that student who needed this the opportunity to work on interpersonal skills such as receiving constructive feedback from a boss. It doesn't necessarily have to give them the specific training that they want to achieve that goal. We have to consider all the needs of the student. Okay, couple of cases to quickly talk about. Just illustrating these cases really, these cases are about the requirement to invite the student. In one case, there was no FAPE denial. In another case, there was a FAPE denial. We'll get into the reasons why. So this was a New York case in 2016. This is really a tuition reimbursement case. And, not surprisingly, that was really the crux of the complaint. But, we know when we receive these due process complaints that attorneys will throw in, really whatever they can to see what sticks. And see whatever lands. So this was an 11th grade student with a speech language impairment, cognition ability generally in this extremely low range. Parents recommended a 15-1 placement. Parents disagreed with that. The CSE never invited the student to talk about transition planning, and the district offered no excuse for why that was the case. There was no reason. Now, a transition plan, a deficient transition plan is considered a procedural flaw. It's not an automatic FAPE denial. So what that means is you will look a little bit deeper. So the rule, and I'm paraphrasing, is no harm, no foul. So if you violate something procedurally and it doesn't result in substantive harm, they'll generally kind of go overlook it. So what they'll look at is, did the failure to invite the student significantly impede the parent's opportunity to participate? And did it deprive the student of educational benefits? And the court said no. And the reason why is because the plan otherwise sufficiently addressed the student's interests. Specifically, it was developed line by line with input from the parents and representatives from the parents' unilateral placement. And the court said without objection. Now, there's not a lot of detail in decision about what went into, how did they assess the student? But another key part of this was there were 22 other goals in this IEP that shed light on the student's interests and needs. So it was pretty clear that the district had done their work to get to what the student's interests were. The other thing the court noted was that, the parents' argument was that the transition goals were not, that the goals in the IP and the transition goals were not measurable. And the court said, well, I don't know how the student's presence at the CSE meeting would have corrected that or would have fixed that. So the student's presence at the CSE meeting wouldn't have cured any deficiency that the parents were pointing out. So that was another reason why it didn't necessarily rise to the level of a FAPE denial. Now, that was not the case in this case. Now, this is an Ohio case that was 3 years earlier. So in this case, we had a student with a severe seizure disorder, diminished cognitive capabilities. There was a long history also between the parents and the district here, acrimonious meetings, yelling, slamming doors. The district didn't invite this student because frankly, they felt that the student would be frightened because the history of the long and adversarial meetings between the parent and district. And also they just thought it was going to be beyond the student's comprehension. Now, a couple of things worked against the district. That the court did find that they deprived the student of FAPE in this instance. And one of the reasons was because they had talked to the student, here and there about what her interests were, but there was generally no effort really done in that regard. That for instance, the staff admitted that they could have exposed her to more opportunities. They could have talked to her more. They also didn't do an assessment until this student was 20 years old. And even at that point, it was because the IHO ordered them to do it. And also in the section on the IEP left for student preferences and interest, it was blank. So, in this case, there was a lot more evidence working against the district, and once they did do an assessment, it said that to the extent she's interested in employment, she should have those opportunities and exposure to those things. But at that point, she's 20 years old. It was almost too late. So from the time she was 16 until the time she was 20, they really had not done anything to, expose her to any of those situations that could help inform, drafting the post-secondary goals. So that's the reason it turned out that way. All right, so these are the resources that I was talking about earlier. You'll see one that's, about halfway down the page, collaborative assessment guide for transition planning services. That's the one that can give you examples of the types of assessments you conduct. The NTACT is the National Teachers Assistance Center on Transition. Down at the bottom here, you'll see June 2024 meeting of the Board of Regents. That's about the New York State's vision for how to transform the graduation requirements, and the FAQ document indented is related to that. So we will briefly touch base on that right now. So this is sort of a glimpse into the future in terms of what exiting will look like. New York is in talks right now. It probably will happen at some point, we don't know when, about changing the graduation requirements. And it looks at the plan is really kind of these four components. They want to adopt what's called a portrait of a graduate framework, redefining credits, sunsetting the diploma assessment requirements, which means, doing away with the current diploma assessment requirements and moving to one diploma. If you achieve there's going to be different ways to achieve the requirements, but at the end of it, you end up with one diploma. And if you pass certain Regents exams, the idea is that you can get additional seals and things like that on your diploma. But we're not going to have a Regents diploma anymore, and a local diploma. We'll have one diploma. So this is what portrait of a graduate looks like. These are the areas that the state is looking to have students demonstrate proficiency in. Literacy across content areas is one slice, cultural competence is another, global citizen, critical thinker, innovative problem solver. These are a little bit vague terms. So we'll have to see, what that looks like. So as I mentioned, under this proposed vision, students would not be required to pass specific assessments, including Regents exams. You can demonstrate, in a nutshell, without reading all of this, you'll be able to demonstrate your proficiency in just different ways. Now, for students with disabilities, this conceivably, makes it easier, or it allows, other different pathways than what we currently offer. Doesn't create a specific pathway, but creates options for students to provide the necessary evidence of their proficiency in high school and learning standards. And I think one of the other goals, as you'll see in this last bullet, is it allows for, I think their aim is to mitigate against perceptions that one means of demonstrating proficiency is easier than others. So trying to, take away the stigma to some degree of some of these other options. So that is a glimpse into the future that, we don't know when or if. I think we can be sure that at some point, some changes will be coming. But again, these are in discussions right now at State Ed. You can go Google this. This is on State Ed's website. They're not hiding the ball here. So, okay. All right. Thank you very much. I know we went over a little bit, but we appreciate it, and we'll see you at the next update. Thank you.